That is a question that you need to ask someone who can actually predict the future. It's something that cannot be anticipated, but I think we have more and more tools at our disposal to try to make sense and to better understand some of the forces that are going to shape our future. We have tools that allow us to, some people like to attribute probabilities to different kinds of futures or different outcomes. But at the same time, I believe that it's important to develop scenarios that help us to think about some of the probable, plausible, possible, and sometimes even outrageous kinds of futures, because history has shown us that we are not great at predicting the future, particularly in the long term. There's always something that is going to emerge and that is going to be new, that will have an impact on our plans, that will have an impact on everything that we have anticipated going forward. But I think in addition to trying to predict the future or anticipate the future, it's also important to have a vision of where we want to go so that we can be in a better position to react once something impacts our path and enact some course corrections. The COVID pandemic that we've lived through over the past 3 years has been, I think, but one of the many pandemics that humanity has endured over the centuries and millennia. It is one of those events that we are exposed to quite regularly. Even the regular flu sweeps the world and causes havoc, wreaks havoc across the planet. Of course, a major effect or a major pandemic like the COVID pandemic has had a much deeper and more profound effect than some of the other epidemics and pandemics that we've come to accept. I think the reality is that a lot of companies, governments, organizations were just ill-prepared to react to some of the impacts that the pandemic has had directly, but also to some of the mitigating strategies that were rolled out in order to minimize the death toll and the sickness that this pandemic would cause. So I think, if anything, this pandemic has alerted decision makers to the fact that we do need to think about the future, that we do need to think about a range of scenarios and some of the possibilities that we could be presented with in the coming years. It is not, I have to say, the presence of or the emergence of the COVID pandemic has not been entirely unforeseen. Some people have developed scenarios precisely for an eventuality like that kind of pandemic. And previously, let's not forget, we had SARS, we had MERS, we had avian flu and swine flu and other things. And back in those days, people developed scenarios to try to anticipate what the impact might look like if those viruses spread and became of global concern. So sooner or later, those things do arrive, do materialize. We do need to be prepared. But, it was not entirely shocking, I would say. Globally, I don't think we were. I think we have noticed that the way individuals, communities and countries have reacted just have demonstrated the level of preparedness and also the level of acceptance of the impact and the response that were necessary to reduce the impact of the viral spread. So I think, no, we were not prepared. Certainly scientifically, we were not prepared. From a policy perspective, we were not prepared. And also from a public health perspective, we were not prepared. I think it is surprising to an extent that we were not, but at the same time, in recent history, we've not lived through a global pandemic like we have over the past 3 years. A number of scenarios have been developed over the years, but it's almost like saying, we have data for virtually everything in the world, and yet we are not aware of every single data point. So while scenarios have been developed, and I think successfully and credibly in a number of locations, it was quite difficult to get systems ready to the point of being able to respond at a very granular level to a pandemic such as the COVID pandemic. You've got to remember the impact the viral impact has meant that we were not prepared with vaccines. We were not aware of the spread initially and the success of the rate of the spread of this virus. So there was a lot of learning that had to be done, that had to be achieved. But the other thing we have to remember is that within record time, companies were able to develop and disseminate at large scale vaccines that ultimately offered a high degree of protection to the populations. There are two questions in the question you asked. So there are a number of tools that we can utilize to try to anticipate the future, or at least to think about a range of possible futures. There is no data about the future. All the data and information we have are about the past. And so there's often a tendency or a desire to use data from the past and extrapolate the future from those data points. And of course, as we've discussed with the COVID pandemic, there are discontinuities that come about, which then upset and force us to rethink everything that we thought we knew about the future. And so that just goes to illustrate the second point in your question, which is there's an inherent uncertainty. We don't know, we cannot predict the future, so the future is fundamentally uncertain, which means that there are some things that over the short term we believe we can anticipate and predict. Over the long term, or the further we will go out into the future, our ability to predict diminishes. Now, uncertainty about the future is not necessarily a bad thing. I think uncertainty about the future can actually be quite empowering and invigorating. Imagine you have a single or linear view of the future, and that particular view is not positive. You have agency over the future. We can do something about the future. We can shape it. Or as the main motto for the Dubai Future Foundation is, that the future belongs to those who can imagine it, design it, and execute it. So we are, to an extent, in charge of our own future, and that's because there is uncertainty about the future. We really can design it, and we can shape it, we can attempt to shape it in as much as we want to reach to where we want to go.